Ella stepped into the hallway of Greenridge Nursing Home, her footsteps echoing against the cold linoleum floor as she made her way toward Mrs. Thompson's room. Mrs. Thompson had been at Greenridge for several years now, her once sharp mind slowly succumbing to the relentless grip of Alzheimer's. She gently pushing open the door, Mrs. Thompson sat in her bed, her thin frame hunched over as she stared blankly at the wall in front of her. Ella could see the flicker of recognition in her eyes as she entered the room, but it was quickly replaced by confusion as Mrs. Thompson struggled to place her. As the day wore on, Ella bathed, dressed, and helped her with her meals, all the while engaging her in gentle conversation. As the hours passed, Ella couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There was a tension in the air, a sense of unease that seemed to settle over the room like a heavy blanket. Night fell over Greenridge, casting the nursing home into darkness. The other residents had long since retired to their beds, leaving Ella alone with Mrs. Thompson in the quiet stillness of the night. She tucked Mrs. Thompson in, adjusting the blankets around her frail form before turning to leave the room. But as she reached for the doorknob, she froze. A chill ran down her spine as she felt a presence in the room, a shadowy figure lurking just beyond the edge of her vision. She turned slowly, her heart pounding in her chest, but there was nothing there, just the empty room bathed in darkness. Shaking her head, Ella dismissed the feeling as her imagination running wild. She had heard stories about Mrs. Thompson's hallucinations, about the things she claimed to see in the darkness of her room, but Ella didn't believe in ghosts or spirits. There had to be a logical explanation for what she had felt, but try as she might, Ella couldn't shake the feeling of unease that settled over her. The shadowy figure haunted Ella's thoughts. She tried to push it to the back of her mind, to focus on her duties as a caregiver, but it was always there, lurking just beyond the edge of her consciousness. And then one night, everything changed. Ella was in Mrs. Thompson's room, helping her with her evening routine when she heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from outside the window. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest as she turned to look. There, outside the window, was the shadowy figure, its form indistinct and ethereal against the darkness of the night. It seemed to pulse and writhe with a life of its own, tendrils of darkness reaching out toward the window, as if trying to break through. Ella's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the figure, her mind racing with fear and disbelief. She had dismissed Mrs. Thompson's claims as the ravings of a diseased mind, but now she could see that there was something else at play, something dark and malevolent that defied explanation. With trembling hands, Ella reached for her phone, her fingers fumbling with the buttons as she tried to dial for help, but before she could utter a word, the room was plunged into darkness, the only sound the echoing laughter of the shadowy figure outside. Panic surged through Ella's veins as she stumbled backward, her heart racing with fear. She groped blindly for the door, her fingers scrabbling against the smooth surface as she tried to find her way out of the room, but it was no use. The darkness was everywhere, pressing in on her from all sides, suffocating her with its malevolent presence. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the darkness was gone, leaving Ella alone in the suffocating silence of Mrs. Thompson's room. She stood there for a moment, her body shaking with fear and adrenaline, before she finally managed to find her way out into the hallway, her mind reeling with disbelief at what she had witnessed. She tried to rationalize it, to convince herself that it had all been a hallucination brought on by stress and exhaustion, but deep down, she knew the truth. There was something in that room with Mrs. Thompson, something dark and sinister that defied explanation. The next morning, Ella arrived at Mrs. Thompson's room to find it empty, the bed neatly made and the window thrown open. Confusion clouded Ella's mind as she searched the room frantically, her heart pounding in her chest. And then she saw it, a single blood-stained handprint smeared across the window pane, a silent testament to the horror that had unfolded in the dead of night. With a sinking feeling in the pit of her stomach, Ella realized the truth. Mrs. Thompson had been taken by the shadow, consumed by the darkness that had haunted her final days. And now, Ella was left to grapple with the chilling realization that some evils cannot be explained away by rational thought.